In the spring of 1943, across the gray expanse of the North Atlantic, German U-boat commanders began filing reports that didn't make sense. Boats that had slipped beneath Allied convoys for years were being found. Not occasionally, consistently, in fog, in darkness, in conditions where detection should have been impossible. The men who read these reports in Berlin, veterans of the tonnage war, architects of the wolfpack doctrine, dismissed the early warnings as coincidence, poor seamanship, perhaps even cowardice. They had built their entire strategic calculus on a single assumption, that a submerged submarine remained invisible to the ships hunting it. By the time they understood what had changed, the Battle of the Atlantic had already turned. The events of spring 1943 would decide whether Britain lived on imported food or starved into submission. What they failed to recognize wasn't a new weapon. It was a shift in the nature of seeing itself. The wolfpack tactic had defined U-boat warfare since 1940. Developed by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm and later commander-in-chief of the German Navy, it relied on coordination, patience, and the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. A single submarine would shadow a convoy until nightfall, then call on others. They would attack on the surface under cover of darkness, using speed and low profile to evade escorts, then vanish before dawn. For 3 years, this method had brought Allied shipping to the edge of collapse. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of merchant shipping. The mathematics were brutally simple. If submarines could sink ships faster than shipyards could replace them, Britain would starve and the war would end. Dönitz believed he needed 300 operational boats in the Atlantic at all times. By early 1943, he had them. But the men returning from patrol in the spring of that year described something their training had never prepared them for. They spoke of attacks that came without warning, of depth charges dropped with surgical precision onto boats running deep and silent, of being forced to surface not by damage, but by relentless, inexplicable pursuit. One commander, operating south of Iceland, reported being hunted for 18 hours by a single corvette that never lost contact, despite evasive maneuvers, despite changing depth, despite shutting down all machinery and drifting in complete silence. The corvette had circled above him like a patient predator, dropping charges in patterns that grew tighter with each pass, until his hull began to buckle and he had no choice but to surface and surrender. In his report, he wrote that the enemy had behaved as though they could see through water. In a sense, they could. The technology was called centimetric radar, operating on wavelengths of 10 centimeters rather than the meter-long waves German intelligence had anticipated. British and American engineers had miniaturized the radar transmitter through the development of the cavity magnetron, a device that allowed high-frequency radar sets to be mounted on aircraft and small escort vessels. These sets could detect a submarine's conning tower in darkness, rain, or fog from several miles away. More critically, they could detect a periscope, even the slim profile of a snorkel mast. The resolution was extraordinary. Where older radar had returned vague blobs, centimetric radar painted a clear picture of the sea surface. A U-boat running at periscope depth, previously invisible to all but the sharpest lookout on the clearest day, now appeared on a glowing cathode screen as a distinct bright dot. German naval intelligence knew the Allies possessed radar. They had captured early sets from downed aircraft and analyzed them thoroughly. But their understanding was rooted in the limitations of their own technology. German radar operated on longer wavelengths, between 50 and 60 centimeters. At that frequency, detection of a small surface target like a submarine conning tower was inconsistent at best. When U-boat command received reports of impossible nighttime detection, they assumed the Allies were using improved versions of known systems, or perhaps deploying more aircraft with searchlights. The idea that radar wavelength could be shortened to 10 centimeters, delivering an order of magnitude improvement in resolution, seemed theoretically possible but practically distant. German scientists believed such a device would require components too large and fragile for shipboard use. They were wrong, but their reasoning was sound given what they knew. The cavity magnetron was a breakthrough they had not achieved and did not anticipate. This misreading had consequences that compounded with terrifying speed. In March 1943, U-boats sank 108 Allied ships. Dönitz believed victory was within reach. In April, sinkings dropped to 56. In May, they fell to 50. But the number that mattered more was different: U-boat losses. In May 1943, 41 U-boats were destroyed. 41 in a single month. The loss rate had crossed a threshold beyond which the campaign could not be sustained. Young men were being sent into the Atlantic with diminishing odds of return, and a strategic command responsible for their deployment still did not fully understand why. The submariners themselves began to understand before their commanders did. They felt it in the rhythm of the hunt. A U-boat on war patrol moved through cycles. Long periods of searching, brief moments of engagement, then escape into the ocean's anonymity. The escape had always been reliable. A crash dive, a silent glide into deep water, and the thunder of propellers above would fade into uncertainty. Hunters relied on visual contact or the faint, erratic pings of Aztec sonar, which could be confused, evaded, or simply outlasted. But now the rhythm had changed. The escape no longer worked. Boats dove and found their pursuers waiting at the probable intercept point. They ran silent and were pinpointed anyway. They surfaced at night in the western approaches, expecting invisibility, and were bracketed by gunfire before the lookouts even saw the escort. One U-boat commander, returning to port in June after operating across the mid-Atlantic air gap, reported that his boat had been attacked 7 times in a single patrol, twice on the surface at night, 5 times while submerged. Each attack had been initiated with no apparent prior contact. He described the sensation of being watched by something that never blinked, never guessed, never lost track. His crew had begun to believe the enemy possessed some form of supernatural awareness, or that there were traitors among the German ranks feeding positions to the Allies. He did not believe these things himself, but he understood why his men did. The alternative, that the fundamental rules of submarine warfare had been rewritten, was harder to accept. The symbolic element that recurred in the accounts from this period was not spoken aloud, but appeared in the routines that submariners clung to as their world grew more dangerous. It was the ritual of the coffee. Every U-boat carried a small supply of real coffee, reserved for moments of particular stress or celebration. In earlier patrols, coffee had been brewed after a successful attack, a small ceremony marking survival and triumph. But in the spring of 1943, the timing changed. Men began brewing coffee before diving, not after surfacing. It became a gesture of uncertain hope rather than earned relief. The boat's cook would prepare it in silence while the crew prepared for descent, and they would drink it quickly, without conversation, as if fortifying themselves for an ordeal whose outcome could no longer be assumed. It was a small inversion, barely worth noting, but it reflected a deeper shift in expectation. The ocean was no longer a refuge. It had become a trap. Dönitz, to his credit, was not a fool. He recognized that losses had become unsustainable, but his diagnosis of the problem was incomplete. He ordered U-boats to remain submerged more often, to avoid surface operations except when absolutely necessary. He directed them to transit areas at deeper depths to minimize periscope exposure. These were reasonable tactical adjustments given what he believed about Allied capabilities. If the enemy had improved their aircraft patrols and visual reconnaissance, staying submerged made sense. But these measures only slowed the bleeding. They did not stop it because they did not address the actual threat. The Allies were not seeing better. They were seeing differently. The confirmation came too late to matter. In late 1943, a German naval intelligence team recovered a centimetric radar set from a crashed Allied aircraft. When they analyzed its components, the reports describe a moment of stunned silence. The cavity magnetron was small, robust, and elegantly designed. It was exactly the kind of engineering solution that theoretical discussions had dismissed as impractical. The realization spread through U-boat command like a cold wind. Every tactical assumption of the past 4 years had been based on the adversary's limitations. Those limitations no longer existed. By that point, the statistical reality was undeniable. In the second half of 1943, U-boats sank fewer ships per patrol than at any point since 1940. Casualty rates among submarine crews exceeded 70%. New boats were being commissioned and sent into the Atlantic with crews barely out of training, and many never returned from their first patrol. The experienced commanders, the men who had hunted convoys along the Newfoundland routes and through the Bay of Biscay in the Atlantic's darkest years, were dead or captured. Their knowledge went with them. The institutional learning curve, so carefully built over 3 years of warfare, collapsed in 6 months. There's a particular kind of historical tragedy in watching a military force recognize its obsolescence too late to adapt. The German U-boat service in 1943 was not defeated by lack of courage or poor seamanship or even inferior technology in an absolute sense. German submarines were well designed, their torpedoes effective, their crews disciplined. What defeated them was the invisible gap between what they knew and what was true. Allied centimetric radar represented not just an incremental improvement, but a categorical shift, a change in kind, not degree. And because German strategic thinking had anchored itself to assumptions about Allied capabilities that were 6 months out of date, the entire apparatus of decision-making became decoupled from reality. The human cost of this decoupling was borne by men in steel tubes beneath the Atlantic. They went into the ocean believing in rules that no longer applied. They trusted that darkness would conceal them, that depth would protect them, that silence would render them invisible. And one by one, they learned otherwise. The learning curve was vertical and lethal. Most did not survive it. There is a photograph from this period, seldom reproduced, showing the interior of a U-boat control room after its crew had surrendered. The image is dim, lit only by emergency lighting, and shows the cramped, pipeline space where men had lived and worked for weeks at a time. On a small, fold-down table, barely visible, sits an empty coffee cup. It is a detail so minor that most viewers would not notice it. But for those who understand the rituals of submarine life, it carries weight. That cup was likely filled and drunk in the moments before the boat dove for the last time, before the radar-guided depth charges found their mark and forced the crew to surface into captivity. It was a gesture of hope made by men who did not yet know they had already lost. The broader strategic consequences unfolded with relentless logic. By autumn 1943, Dönitz withdrew the bulk of his U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic. It was not a formal surrender, but it was a recognition of defeat. The convoy routes, those vital lifelines carrying American men and material to Britain, were no longer contestable. The mathematics that had once favored the submarine now favored the convoy. Every additional escort equipped with centimetric radar multiplied the danger to attacking U-boats exponentially. The ocean had become transparent. German engineers scrambled to develop countermeasures. They designed radar warning receivers to detect centimetric transmissions, giving U-boats a few seconds of warning before an attack. They experimented with radar-absorbent coatings and snorkel devices that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, reducing surface time. Some of these innovations were effective in isolation, but none restored the strategic balance. The Allies adapted faster, refining their radar systems, improving coordination between aircraft and surface ships, deploying hunter-killer groups that pursued U-boats across entire ocean sectors from the western approaches to the waters south of Greenland. The cycle of innovation and counter-innovation tilted decisively in one direction. What makes the story of centimetric radar particularly instructive is not merely that it was a technological surprise. War is full of surprises, but that the surprise was predictable. The physics were known. The potential advantages were understood. German scientists had considered and dismissed the possibility not because it was impossible, but because it seemed impractical given the constraints they imagined. They assumed the Allies faced the same engineering challenges Germany did. They assumed wrong. The Allies had access to different resources, different manufacturing techniques, different scientific networks. And because German intelligence misread the pace of Allied development by even 6 months, an entire branch of military strategy collapsed. There is something almost pedagogical in the precision of the failure. It was not a failure of effort or courage. It was a failure of imagination, compounded by the institutional inertia that affects all large military organizations. U-boat command had built a doctrine that worked brilliantly within a specific set of conditions. When those conditions changed, the doctrine could not. By the time the evidence became undeniable, the window for adaptation had closed. The men who served on U-boats in late 1943 and 1944 understood this in ways their commanders did not. They went on patrol knowing the odds, knowing that most boats did not return, knowing that the rituals of coffee and silence and depth were no longer sufficient. They went anyway because that is what orders required and what duty demanded. Some believed in the cause they served. Others simply believed in each other. The question of why men continue fighting in a lost war is complex and does not yield to easy answers. But in the case of the U-boat crews, part of the answer lies in the incremental nature of the disaster. It did not arrive all at once. It accumulated patrol by patrol, loss by loss, until the cumulative weight became undeniable. By war's end, Germany had commissioned over 1,100 U-boats. More than 700 were lost. Casualty rates among submariners exceeded those of any other branch of the German military. The tonnage war, the campaign to strangle Allied supply lines, had failed completely. Britain did not starve. American factories outproduced German shipyards by margins that would have seemed impossible in 1940. The industrial capacity that centimetric radar represented was not an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper disparity, one rooted in resources, infrastructure, and the accumulated advantages of democratic economies capable of sustained mobilization. The misreading of 1943 was not an isolated intelligence failure. It was a structural blindness, a consequence of fighting a war against an adversary whose capabilities were systematically underestimated. German strategic planning in 1940 assumed the Allies would behave as they had in 1918, slowly, cautiously, constrained by limited production and divided priorities. But the Allies of 1943 were different. They had learned from earlier failures. They had industrialized on a scale without historical precedent. And they had married that industrial strength to scientific innovation in ways that continually outpaced Axis expectations. The story of centimetric radar is, in the end, a story about the limits of knowledge and the dangers of assuming the enemy remains static. It is a reminder that wars are not fought in the conditions we expect, but in the conditions that emerge. And those conditions, shaped by technology and industry and human ingenuity, do not wait for permission to change. The commanders who sent U-boats into the Atlantic in May 1943 were operating with a map of reality that was already obsolete. The men who paid the price for that obsolescence were the ones who never returned. In the archives, there are records of the last radio transmissions from U-boats that vanished in 1943. They are brief, procedural, unremarkable. Position reports, weather observations, routine confirmations, and then silence. Not the silence of radio discipline, but the permanent silence of steel torn open beneath the waves. Those transmissions were sent by men who believed they were still fighting the war they had trained for, the war where darkness and depth provided sanctuary. They were wrong, and by the time the truth reached them, it arrived in the form of depth charges falling through black water, guided by invisible eyes that never blinked.